The king can do no wrong. It's a famous phrase, right? But for centuries, this wasn't just a saying, it was an ironclad legal shield for the English crown. Literally absolute immunity. I mean, if the king's guards just trampled all over your crops, or a sudden royal decree completely bankrupted your business, tough luck. You had zero legal recourse. The sovereign's power was absolute, and honestly, accountability just wasn't a thing.
But let's fast forward to today. What actually happens in a modern democracy when, say, a government driver totals your car? Or a state-run hospital acts completely negligently? You can't just look a citizen in the eye, shrug, and say, well, the state can do no wrong, and just walk away. So let's dive into this explainer. Because this specific tension between the massive power of the state to govern and your fundamental right as a citizen to seek justice is honestly one of the most fascinating areas of modern law. We're looking at exactly that, power versus accountability, and the state's legal liability. We'll be using Indian constitutional law as our lens today to explore how a modern legal system actually balances sovereign power with government accountability. It's like a giant puzzle. We're going to look at the defensive shields the government gets to hold and the offensive tools everyday citizens can use to hold the state responsible. To break this all down, we're going to cover 5 key areas today. First, state liability and torts. Second, entering government contracts. Third, the doctrines of estoppel and waiver. Fourth, statutory immunity and sovereign acts. And finally, number 5, government privileges in court.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, state liability in torts. Basically, what happens when the government commits a civil wrong? So a tort is essentially just a civil wrong. We're talking about situations where government officials mess up while on the job. Things like negligence, wrongful detention, or trespass. Now, under Article 300 of the Indian Constitution, the baseline is set. The union and the states can sue, and they can be sued. But the million-dollar question has always been, exactly when can they be held liable? To figure this out, courts historically did something really interesting. They split the state's personality right down the middle. On one side, you've got sovereign functions. These are the core fundamental tasks of governance, right? Defense, law and order, administering justice. Historically, if the state messed up here, they got full immunity. But on the other side are non-sovereign functions. Think transport services, public hospitals, or commercial contracts. If the state starts acting like a private business in these areas, well, they get treated like one, meaning they can be held completely liable for their mistakes. Let's actually look at how this tension plays out in the courtroom with real people. It really all started with the P&O Steam Navigation Company case. That's the one that officially laid down that split between sovereign and non-sovereign functions we just talked about. Then, we saw a massive win for citizens. In the state of Rajasthan versus Vidyawadi case, the court actually held the state liable when a government driver negligently caused an accident. Big deal, right? But then, the state shield went right back up in custody law versus state of UP. There, the court granted immunity simply because the wrongful act was tied to police powers, which, again, is a sovereign function. However, the courts have really narrowed that immunity over time. Take Liability Behera versus state of Orissa. This case completely transformed the landscape. The court recognized constitutional compensation for violations of fundamental rights. They basically said, look, when the state abuses its power and violates your core rights, you cannot just hide behind sovereign immunity. No way.
Moving on to Section 2, entering government contracts, playing by constitutional rules.
You see, the government isn't just making laws. It's literally the biggest consumer in the entire country. It buys, it builds, it supplies. But because they're playing with taxpayer money, our money, Article 299 of the Constitution lays out a super strict, mandatory 3-step checklist for any valid government contract. Step 1, it absolutely must be expressed in the name of the president or the governor. Step 2, it has to be executed on their behalf, and Step 3, it must be executed by an explicitly authorized person. Now, you might be thinking, that's just bureaucratic red tape. Actually, no. As we saw in landmark cases like Bikram Jaipuria and KP Chowdhury, these rules are mandatory. They're there to prevent unauthorized contracts, stop fraudulent claims, and protect public funds. So, if a government official just shakes your hand and promises you a lucrative deal, well, legally speaking, that handshake is completely meaningless.
But wait, what if you didn't know that? What if you already built a road or delivered a ton of supplies based on that handshake, only to find out later that the contract totally failed that Article 299 test? Does the government just get to keep your free stuff? Thankfully, no. This is where courts step in with a really cool equitable principle called quantum merit. It literally translates to as much as is earned. As the court discussed in the Mulam Chand case, even if a government contract is technically invalid, courts can use this principle to step in and grant relief. It's a safety net, right? Designed to prevent unjust enrichment, making sure the government doesn't just unfairly profit off a citizen's hard work over a legal technicality.
Let's look at Section 3, Doctrines of Estoppel and Waiver, forcing the government to play fair.
These equitable principles we're talking about, they exist to control how parties behave, and yes, that includes the state. They basically force the government to play fair, be consistent, and operate in good faith. First up is promissory estoppel. In plain English, if the government makes a clear promise to you and you actually change your position or spend money relying on that exact promise, the government can't just suddenly say, oops, never mind. Indian courts have boldly expanded this rule against the government in cases like Anglo-African agencies and Motilal Padampat. Imagine the state promises you a huge tax exemption to build a factory. You go ahead and build it. Well, the state is legally stopped from going back on its word just because they changed their mind.
But, and this is absolutely crucial to remember, this doctrine has some very hard limits when you're dealing with the state. You cannot use promissory estoppel to force the government to do something illegal. You can't force them to ignore a written statute. And most importantly, you cannot demand they fulfill a promise if doing so goes actively against the public interest. So the law definitely protects citizens, but never at the expense of society as a whole.
Now, the flip side of estoppel is the doctrine of waiver. This happens when you voluntarily and intentionally give up a legal right that you know you have. You have the right, but you choose not to use it. Simple enough, right? But when we apply this to public law, there is a massive constitutional caveat. If we look quickly at the famous Bashashar-Nath case, the court firmly established that, generally speaking, individuals cannot waive their fundamental rights. And why is that? Because these rights aren't just for your personal benefit, they are a matter of public policy and public interest. The state simply cannot use your waiver as a convenient loophole to bypass its own constitutional duties.
Moving right along to Section 4, Statutory Immunity and Sovereign Acts, the government's defensive shield.
So, despite all the accountability we've just talked about, make no mistake, the government still holds a massive defensive shield. And the ultimate shield is what we call the active state doctrine. We're talking about high-level, sovereign political acts performed by the state. Usually these involve foreign affairs or external entities, and they operate completely outside ordinary domestic law. Think war actions, annexing territory, or major diplomatic moves. The Burma Oil Company case is a perfect classic example here, discussing immunity during wartime actions. Look, if the military has to blow up a bridge to stop an invading army, you generally cannot drag the state into a local civil court to sue for property damage. It's an active state, pure and simple.
But hey, we live in a modern legal system, and even the active state doctrine has boundaries now. Modern constitutionalism has really restricted this broad immunity. If an action is proven to be malafide, meaning it was done in bad faith, or if an official clearly oversteps their statutory limits, or, most importantly, if fundamental rights are violated, the courts can and absolutely will pierce right through that shield. The days of blind, unquestioned government immunity, yeah, those are pretty much over. And finally, Section 5, Government Privileges in Court, Procedural Advantages. Here's the reality. Even when you do manage to sue the state and drag them into a courtroom, the government doesn't play by the exact same rules as you or me. The law actually accommodates administrative necessity by giving them some very specific procedural advantages. For example, under evidence law, the state can simply refuse to hand over unpublished official documents if they claim it harms public interest. Also, you usually have to give them a mandatory prior notice before you can even file a suit against them, giving them a head start to settle. They also get extended limitation periods, meaning they literally have more time to file claims than everyday citizens do. And of course, they have absolute protection over state secrets involving diplomacy or national security.
As you can probably guess, this creates a profound tug-of-war in the courts. On one side of the rope, you have cases like State of Punjab v. Sodhi Sukhdev Singh. That ruling firmly upheld the state's privilege to keep official documents secret, prioritizing the protection of state administration. But then, on the exact opposite side, you have the landmark S.P. Gupta v. Union of India case. There, the court aggressively pushed back. They emphasized democratic transparency and placed very strict, narrow limits on what the government can claim as a privilege. So it's this constant, ongoing balancing act between the state's very real need for secrecy to govern securely and the public's absolute right to individual justice.
Which leaves us with this final, really vital thought. The liability of the state has undeniably evolved. We've gone from the historic, absolute immunity of the king can do no wrong, all the way toward a system of rigorous constitutional accountability. But here's the thing. The state's footprint is expanding every single day, into our digital lives, into public health, into global commerce. So as state functions continue to grow and become more complex, where exactly should we draw the line between sovereign power and citizen protection? It's a huge question, and one that our courts, and really we as a society, are going to have to keep answering. Think about that for a bit. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.